Alright, hello friends, this is Eli from Mystic Circuits. I just wanted to make a quick video. I don't have a script and I'm going to do as little editing as possible to this. I just wanted to go over the new firmware that I plan on updating and putting out on our GitHub tonight. This means that you will be able to take a look at everything going on in the IDUM firmware and modify things yourself. I did my best to make everything as readable and easy to understand as possible, although it is quite a large program, so you will have to be able to navigate multiple pages and keep track of things across them. But I did do a couple of things in order to hopefully give you some access to some under the hood kind of goodies without having to do too much. So if you go to the software, you will need the Arduino IDE, and I go through the specifics on how to actually install that and to install your firmware in another video. This is more just going to be going over what's being added in this specific firmware. So you'll go to the software, open it with the Arduino IDE, and it will bring up all of these different pages. Now you'll see the first one is IDUM Firmware version 0.95. That's because there are still some features that we want to add in order to make it version 1. And that basically includes the 16-step mode and the split mode, which is going to let you do different modifications on each channel separately. Those will be included in the next firmware update. So we have our lovely text over here. And if you scroll down, there's some basics here going on, and basically there's a handful of options at the bottom of this first page, right? And I'll just go over them one by one. Basically, the first option makes it so that normally when you have a modification going, IDUM decides to start a modification, and then it waits until you have sent it a trigger or a gate on each channel in order to sort of activate the modification for that channel. So that means in burst mode, it's not going to add any bursts until it receives a trigger, and then it adds bursts for the rest of the modification. This makes it so that it's not technically adding gates or triggers into portions of the pattern where they aren't already happening. So it's not sort of like making a new pattern out of your pattern, it's just modifying your existing pattern. So if you turn on the choke disable function by basically putting a 1 on this line where it says bool choke disable equals 0, instead of a 0 you put a 1. And what that's going to do is it's going to make it so that IDUM no longer waits for triggers to come in order to add whatever sort of gate patterns the modification is doing. So that means that it'll just start injecting bursts in. It will start doing the breakbeats or the gate delays and bouncing balls, things like that. And you might get some chaotic sort of behavior because some of these things will be referenced to triggers that happened before the modification started, but it generally does a pretty interesting job of sort of adding more to your pattern than it would if you went with the default IDUM behavior, which is to wait for triggers to come in. The second option is called freeze param, and I think that this will be a bit more useful once we get to the split mode option being available. Basically, freeze param makes it so that whenever a modification starts, you're no longer able to modulate the param knob while that modification is active. So it sort of samples the param knob while that modification is active and keeps it there until the end of the modification. And this can be useful because you can, for example, have really fast modulation going into param knob and get results that are maybe more chaotic than you want. Freeze param will make it so that, for example, if you're doing a burst that's multiplied by 4, it'll stay as a multiple of 4, and then you are still able to use modulation in order to change that value, just not while the modifications are happening. So it was a pretty easy option to add, so I felt like it was something that maybe people wanted to mess around with and get some more predictable results out of their IDUM. The third option, which is the only other one that technically is going to give you different behavior, is the carryover disable. I added a function that causes IDUM to keep track of when it's going from one modification straight into another modification, and it won't reset certain variables when it does that. And one of the reasons why I added this was because, like, let's say you have a modification that starts on the 7th beat of a let's say you're doing like a breakbeat and you're doing it as a multiple of 8, and if it started on the 7th beat of your incoming pattern, it would sound different than it would on the 4th beat or the 3rd beat or something like that of your incoming pattern. And so I found that letting it just go straight into the next modification without resetting all of these variables would make it so that no matter where it happened in the no matter where your modification activated in the course of your incoming pattern, it would sort of land on similar results. I don't expect that to make a ton of sense to everyone, but I think that if you try turning off carryover disable, you'll notice that, for example, in breakbeat mode, if you change the length of the beat, it'll actually reset the pattern whenever you run out the length of your modification, and that can actually come up with some really interesting results that makes it sound quite a bit different than it does normally. I'd like to also show you some stuff that requires actually looking at the synth. So basically, just really quickly, you can see here we have all of our different core functions of IDUM in this program. They all start with A, 0, blah, 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 because that's, for whatever reason, the only way that Arduino is able to keep track of the order of pages in the way that you want them. You've got your variables, you've got your timers for the timer interrupts, you have setup, which runs once, and then it goes straight into the loop, which runs over and over again for the rest of your for the rest of the time that IDUM is on, and it calls all of the other relevant functions. And one thing that if you did want to try and mess around with IDUM, probably the easiest thing would be to like take one of the modes out and put in your own mode, right? So if you look, it's cut off, but let's say if you click on the upper right hand corner, you can go through all the pages, and you'll notice that it goes A 1 through 90, and then it goes B10, B20, B30, and those are all the different modes start with a B. So we could go to B hold mode. You can see here that it says it basically gives you the function of how hold mode is supposed to work, and then if you go down to the bottom, there are these variables called trig1 state, trig2 state, trig3 state, as well as at the top there's the clock state. Those are all the variables that you would return in order to tell IDUM to turn either on or off a gate on that specific step. So best of luck. If you have any questions, send them to me. I'll do my best to answer everything. But yeah, no promises, because recently, most of my time has been spent building IDUMs, so I don't have a ton of free time, but I still do my best to answer all the messages and emails that I get. So let's go ahead and take a look at our synth. I apologize for how grainy the video is. I know just enough about lighting to know that I'm doing it wrong. But you can still tell here, oh, look, what is this? This is a black panel IDUM. I have a very limited number of them, and it's quite likely by the time that you see this video, they'll be gone. So if you're watching this and you're one of the people who's been constantly asking me for black panel IDUMs, I would suggest looking at the website right now, because they're going to disappear very quickly. So you'll also notice that there is still some flicker on the mode ring, but I've actually done quite a bit in order to reduce that flicker as much as I possibly could. So less flickering than before. I also spent a lot of time on things that people may or may not actually realize are a thing. So most of you are doing just fine with taking IDUM to process gates and send them out and just doing that. But IDUM also will affect the clock of a sequencer that it's plugged into, and the best way to show that is to show it with a tree and leaves combo. Sorry, I'm just like catching my breath a little. Okay, so I'm going to turn up the volume. We've got just a normal pattern coming in from our performer. It's going into IDUM, and then turn it down a tiny bit. So we've got performer going into IDUM, which is then sending a couple of gates into the bass, snare, and hi-hat of the quad drum, and then the fourth gate is going into plats. The voltage sequence is coming from our second leaves up here, which is being driven by the clock out of IDUM, right? And so some of you may have noticed that, like, if I were to, in fact, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to put this into the faster clock mode. Okay. Some of you may have noticed that if you were to, like, hold a gate for a couple of beats, right? You turn this off and it'll hold that step for as many beats as you are running your modification for. If I turn up this switch, it'll jump back to the position that it's supposed to be at in the sequence, right? So that's handy in case you want to maintain the cycle, the original pattern of your sequence, right? So you just kind of listen to the sequence that we have here. Now we're doing some stuff to mess with that sequence a little bit. You can see the step that we're on is jumping around. And then we exit that, and we have left the modifications, but we're still at the same point in the sequence that we started at. Now, IDUM can do a couple of other things, right? So now if we're in the looper mode, you'll see the length is set to 1. And actually, if I turn the length up, you can hear that we have a 4-step loop held with the gates, but we also have a 4-step loop happening with our external sequencer being leaves, tree leaves. And the way that this works is by sending out really fast bursts. I can send out really fast bursts of clock to leaves, to tree and leaves, and it'll just jump forward by a certain number of steps in order to actually, in order to simulate as if it had only a 4-step loop, right? And I can do this with shorter loops, right? Whoa. So if I do 2, right? You'll see here when we get to the second step, we just send out 7 clocks really, really fast until we get back to the first step. And we can actually do this. Let me do it like this. So we could change the speed of this. And you'll notice we're doing that really fast. And we're still on the same 2 steps of our 8-step sequencer that we started out with. And that's because IDUM is doing this quite reliably. Now, you'll notice with the cycle switch up, if we leave the loop, we're actually playing the same sequence that we started out with. And that's because the entire time we're doing all this crazy clock stuff, IDUM is actually keeping track of where you're supposed to be in the sequence, and then shoots out a bunch of clocks to catch you back up with that point at the end of the time that you're messing with your clock. And hopefully that's going to be the same place as you started in your sequence. Now, I'm going to add a lot of caveats, right? This works mostly with tree and leaves, and there's a reason that I've kind of packaged them all together. Is because tree and leaves can do all of the weird clock manipulation stuff that IDUM wants to do to it, right? There's another mode, which lets you slow down the clocks that are coming out in order to have it work better with digital and just generally slower sequencers, right? But if you want it to work perfectly, or as close to perfectly as possible, you should use IDUM with tree and leaves. And just as an example, there's this last mode, right? Which all it does is it makes you mess with the clock, right? So if we do some of this kind of stuff, we're actually having IDUM jump around in the sequence, right? Or we're ratcheting. I'm going to turn the probability all the way up. And then you can see here, we're getting these really fast clock jitters. If I put the length to 1, you can see we're actually doing this really weird effect to the clock where we're having it ratchet forward and then it jumps back. I'm actually going to turn off the drums for this. It's not super necessary. Yeah, so you can see there's actually a lot of really weird effects we can do with IDUM's clock manipulation, right? I'm just messing with the param knob now. On the right side, it ratchets. On the left side, it skips, right? And after all of this is said and done, if I turn back on the drum machine, you can hear it's at the same point in the sequence that we started. Now, you can do some even crazier stuff by going into the loop mode, right? And now this mode knob acts as an offset for not only our loop, but also the sequencer that's hooked up to the clock output, right? So you can see here, I'm actually just, it's hard to tell like this, but if I go like that, I'm actually scrubbing the output. I'm scrubbing the sequencer that's connected to our clock output, right? And if I put an LFO into here, I've got an LFO coming from Tides, right? I'll slow it down a tiny bit to really make this effect obvious. So I'm plugging an LFO into the mode knob, into the mode CV input, right? So it's going to be hard to show that, but basically, trust me that there's an LFO coming out of here, and that's what's driving IDUM's mode input, and that with that you can see that we're scrubbing our sequencer with this LFO, right? Now here's the crazy thing. Watch how the one side of the range goes to the red LED and the other side of the range goes to the orange LED. I'm going to start making this LFO go faster. You see how it's still in the same position as where it started? This is my first take. I'm not like, I really don't want to do another take. But you could see how it's keeping track of where it is. Now I'm going to exit the loop. And you can hear that our sequence is in the same position as where we started, right? So my goal is to make it so that this works with as many different sequencers as possible. But right now, I can only guarantee that it works with the newest firmware, with tree and leaves. And when you go in the menu, right, you hold the mode button for the menu. You're also going to have to make sure that this pink LED all the way on the left where hold mode is on. And I'll show you why. Basically, I'm going to turn off that LED and then exit the menu. And we're just going to do the simple hold modifications that you do sometimes. And you can see here the function where it catches up with where it's supposed to go. It's much slower, right? It takes a couple of seconds, like not a couple seconds, like maybe a couple of milliseconds to get there, right? And that's because we're intentionally slowing down the clock that would normally be catching you up with where you're supposed to be at, in order to make it so that sequencers that don't have as high of a reaction speed of bandwidth, to be technical, but like a reaction speed, are able to do some of this funky clock trickery. And I'm going to be very clear, this was actually a lot harder to get to work than the faster clock mode, because it needs to like keep track of steps that it's sending out. And then let's say you didn't finish your most recent skip function, and you're telling it to skip more, then it needs to keep track of how many steps you're adding. And then let's say a trigger clock came in while this is happening, you have to keep track of that. And then what's going on with your clock when your skip function is over, you sometimes have to keep track of that. So there's a lot of stuff going on over the hood, and it is not working perfectly. You will sometimes lose a step, or forwards or backwards, or possibly mess up the timing of your sequence. It doesn't work perfectly. My goal is to get it as close to working perfectly as possible as I can for the next firmware update that's also going to include the split mode and the 16-step mode. Now, I'm going to show just kind of what it works like, and usually I do that by going into the ornament and crime sequencer, and hopefully my encoder is kind of busted on this, but it seems to be working. Sequence. All right, so now let's go ahead and run a clock into here. All right, so maybe I can get to the actual sequence. Maybe it'll show me edit. Yeah, okay, so you can see on the ornaments and crimes, turn this off again. You can see on the screen for ornaments and crimes, it's a little fuzzy, but we have an 8-step sequence, right? And now if I do a hold, you can see it jumping around. and it's still in the position that it's supposed to work. So this kind of clock catching up works pretty well for the first 7 modes on IDUM, right? The 8th mode, the clock skipping and manipulation, that's the biggest culprit for making you go out of sync with your original sequence, right? So I would say like the cycle maintenance function actually works quite well if you're just doing the normal modifications where you're like gonna ratchet for 8 steps and then shoot out a bunch of clocks in order to catch you back up with where you're supposed to be, right? It also works pretty dang well with the looper. So I'm gonna go ahead and do this a couple times. You can tell that we're back at the original step that we're supposed to be at, and this is actually a really good way to tell how well your sequencer works with IDUM. So let's try doing 4 steps, right? We're doing a 4-step loop, and you kind of have to just either listen or look to tell if the sequence is changing, but we're going to make this faster. And you can see it's still doing the same 4 steps. Let's say that we were doing this. You might in fact have another sequencer that you're testing out with IDUM right now to see if it works, if it plays nicely with the clock manipulation. And you might be doing this and noticing that every once in a while your selection of 4 steps that you're looping has shifted by 1. Or maybe it doesn't like this at all. Maybe it's just going all over the place. If we keep going faster, you can see we're still on the same 4 steps, right? I did a lot of testing with ornaments and crimes. I can say that it handles the clock manipulation at the slower speeds quite nicely. You can also do you can tell that the sequence hasn't lost its place here. That's pretty good, right? So you can get a lot of really funky clock manipulation stuff out of IDUM. I mean, if you're only using it for the gate sequencing stuff, there's no problem with that. But if you ever get to a point where you're like, I wonder what else IDUM could do, I highly suggest using the clock output in order to manipulate other sequencers, even if you're not doing it in such a way where everything is going, you're like, oh, I want it to like perfectly go back to the place that it was at beforehand. And you know, with certain sequencers, again, that's simply not possible. You can still get some really interesting results out of it. Like, let me show you just a little bit of something. So I'm going to turn back on the drums, and we're going to turn off the cycle maintenance, right? And I'm going to turn the probability down, but the length up, right? And I think I'm going to turn on a ratchet. So now we still have our original 8-step sequence, right? But every once in a while, we're holding one of those steps for longer and also doing a modification while that's happening, right? And so, as you can tell, the sequence it's repeating itself, but it's not always in sync with the original position that the sequence started with, the original cycle, right? That's sort of how I'm imagining the cycle maintain function working, right? This actually gives this simple sequence that we had before, right? Like, let me just do it. This is just our normal 8-step sequence. You know, you might get tired of listening to this after a while. IDUM's really nice for that. If you just want, you know, just a tiny bit of ratcheting, our length is still at 1. Adding in gates every once in a while, that adds a tiny bit of variation. But also, if we're turning the length up, now we're also altering the note sequence that is connected to the sequencer coming from the clock output of IDUM. I realized that this video was really long, but again, I didn't want to do any editing. I've done a lot of proofreading and stuff like that over the last couple days in order to get this firmware up. I'm shooting to have the hardware files up next week. We'll see. I mean, I have a lot of soldering to do before I go visit my family next week. And there's also a heat wave in LA, and it's making it very difficult to maintain productivity. But yeah, thanks for watching. I hope that this was helpful. Again, I highly encourage people to edit their own firmware if you have questions about things that could either be improved or that aren't clear and could be better explained, or if you just want to show me something cool that you did with your IDUM, please reach out. I love to see this kind of stuff. I will just say really briefly, it's already said plenty of times explicitly in the firmware files. This is released open source as a Creative Commons share-alike attribution and share-alike license, which means if you use this code in your own products, I specifically did not put in non-commercial because I think that it's important. You know what? I don't particularly care if you make money off of this. What I do care about is if you release something that competes with IDUM, that is going to affect me quite a bit. I am not a gigantic company. I can't absorb just random people cloning my products the way that someone like Mutable can. It's arguable whether or not they were able to, you know? But all I can say is that I'm doing this under the honor system. I hope that this code is helpful to you, and if you are going to release a product with it and you're not sure if it'll step on my toes, reach out. I'm pretty nice about this kind of stuff. At least I try to be. So you know what? If it does make you money, more power to you. If it competes with me, I'm going to stop open sourcing my stuff, and I'm going to let everybody know who the reason is. So that, you know, that's the only agency that I have in this thing. I'm just putting all of my work into the ether, trusting that people are going to do the right thing with it. So you know what? Do the right thing with it. Hope all of this was helpful. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see y'all real soon.